Hi, everyone. So I have to be out this afternoon. So I thought I would just record my intro to this new unit, and then you can go do the assignment. Okay, so we are starting Unit 5, which is on the early modern era in Europe. So just to for some background, right? The Common Era, so 0 to now, can be divided into these parts. The Classical Age, right, 0 to 400, so that's kind of like the Roman era. The Dark Ages, 400 to 1000. The Middle Ages, or the medieval period that we've kind of been talking about, 1000 to 1350. The Early Modern Era, which is what we're going to focus on now, 1350 to about 1700. Right? The Modern Age, 1700 to 1919, the end of World War I. And then the postmodern era, right, 1919 to the present. So we've already kind of been talking about, during globalization, we talked about, things that were happening during the medieval period with the Mongols and things like that, and then things that were also happening during the early modern period with globalization and the age of exploration. So we're going to kind of zoom in and focus just on Europe during the early modern period. So here are kind of all the things that we're going to cover over the next couple units. So we already talked about the Black Death. We already talked about the Age of Exploration, both of which happened during this period. So today we're going to look at something called the Little Ice Age, which was a period of climate change. There was also a military revolution during this time period. The Renaissance, which we'll look at this week. The Reformation, which was a change in Christianity. The scientific revolution led to the development of scientific theory and discoveries about the natural world. And then the age of absolutism, right, which was a period of absolute monarchs. So we're going to kind of examine all of those things that we haven't talked about yet, all of which were kind of happening at once. So this was a very significant period and kind of led to the development of our modern world, which is why we're zooming in on it. Okay, so let's focus a little bit first on the Middle Ages, which was a period preceding before the early modern era. So the period of about 1000 to 1300 CE is known as the High Middle Ages. This era was defined by feudalism, which was an economic and political system based on land, rich landlords, and personal loyalty, right? So essentially, royals or nobles or landowners would own a piece of land. The people who lived there would work on it, and they were directly loyal to those landowners, right? It was also defined by Catholicism, right? So the Christian church of this time had an extremely strong political power and exerted influence on all culture across Europe, right? So those were kind of the two things that really defined the period: feudalism and Catholicism. So from during this period, Europe saw a dramatic population growth that was then, at the end of this period, decimated by the Black Death. A quickly expanding economies, largely to the Silk Roads and the Mongol globalization. Great advances in structural engineering, which is building, and then metallurgy, which is working of metals, right? Which then lead to the conquest of the Americas with the development of steel and things like that. A significant increase in literacy and being able to read and write. And that's very important for what comes afterwards for the early modern period, is regular people being able to read and write. Okay. So at the same time, during this period, even though all of these things like population growth and expanding economies and literacy were growing, at the same time, most people, regular people, lived in crushing poverty. And most people had almost no access to education and almost no chance to improve their life. Pretty much, if you were born a peasant, you were going to die a peasant, and your life was not very good. There was not a lot of advance in science, right? Because it was subordinate to religion, right? Really, Catholicism dominated the culture, and science was kind of, not accepted, and barely advanced in about 1,000 years. There weren't a lot of centralized governments. There weren't really kingdoms in the way we think about them. They were pretty much small and based on, small patches of land. Um, Medieval Europe had a lot of flaws, but it was a successful society. And Europe really thrived in the High Middle Ages. This was a period of, significant culture for the High Middle Ages, even though life was not very good for a lot of people. But it also had a lot of problems and no real way to fix them. So even though it was a successful society, there were also a lot of problems and stagnation. Okay, so then we get to the 1300s or the 14th century, right? So remember, when we talk about centuries, you're always one before, right? So from 1300 to about 1450, a series of calamities, of problems brought an end to really the Middle Ages, right? And so this is really the dawning of the early modern era. So these include a period of climate change that lasted actually almost 500 years up until 1850, called the Little Ice Age. Of significant famine in Europe, right? A period where crops failed and people went hungry and died. The Black Death, right, which we've already talked about, significant tragedy, killed off, maybe up to 50% of Europe's population. Peasant revolts, right? So people start to rise up against their kind of, bad life. And a series of long, bloody wars across Europe. So all of these were massive changes at the end of the Middle Ages that really lead to the early modern era. So the early modern era saw the first really truly global trade network with the opening of the New World to Europe and the Columbian Exchange, right? The death of 30 to 60% of Europe with the Black Death, a drop in global temperatures, which led to difficulty in growing crops, but also the birth of modern science and math, which really lead to like the Industrial Revolution and to all the ways we live now. And also the end of Catholic dominance in Europe and kind of the splintering of Christianity, which has a lot of consequences. As well as the development of absolute monarchies in Europe, which then on their own lead to revolutions and kind of the dawning of democracy. So a lot of things happening during this period. So the early modern era is really the foundation of the Enlightenment, which is changes in how we think about humans live, modern science, and then the Industrial Revolution, which is the change in moving from hand making things to machine making things, and really leads to our modern world, right? So all of those things are really founded in this early modern period. However, it could probably not have happened until the end of the medieval system, which occurred with all these crises. Right? So today you're going to read a little bit about the medieval period, just a little bit about feudalism and Catholicism. And then you're going to read a little bit about some of those crises we talked about the Little Ice Age, about all of those different things that were happening. And that led to the beginning of the early modern era, which then we'll start talking about tomorrow. Okay, so now you're going to go do that assignment, Medieval Europe and Crises of the 14th Century. And that's it for today. Thank you. Have a good day.